If you played the recent Diablo 4 open beta, you undoubtedly have experienced some of the MMO type features that the game has. And I think most of these social features, like having a pretty large town hub, seeing other players in events out in the open world, and how easy it is to party up, have largely been received positively. But what if this is actually just the beginning of a slew of MMO style features that Blizzard has planned for down the line? What if the world bosses, which are multiplayer events, is a way for Blizzard to test the waters to see players' reception towards multiplayer content? And while I do think that players should not have to commit to any sort of multiplayer only content to be able to fully progress their characters, I do believe that Diablo 4 can and should be its own game, not to be tied down by any of its predecessors, as long as these features can add some depth to the game, and also if Blizzard keeps staying open to player feedback. Speaking of which, in a very recent interview with Wowhead, game director Joe Shelley actually mentioned being open to the idea of adding more clan features to Diablo 4. And even if there won't necessarily be content outside of the world bosses that'll absolutely require you to be in a party to play, I think the game can be more fun and deep if there are, first of all, additional small incentives for grouping up, and also even playstyles and mechanics that can benefit from having more party members and specialized roles within a party at that. Of course, we can't really expect, nor would it really make sense to have traditional MMO style party roles for a game like Diablo. But very interestingly, even just from what we saw from the beta, there already seems to be things like item affixes, skill builds, mechanics, including combat mechanics, as well as monster and boss mechanics, that seems to imply and incentivize group-oriented play and even specific group roles. And with that, let's start with tanking or damage soaking oriented mechanics that are already in the game. Now, of course, even in Diablo 3, tanking has already been kind of a thing, with a party member taking on that role to, say, group monsters together to make it more efficient to clear them and also to soak up damage. However, Diablo 4 actually takes this much further by not only introducing new mechanics for building tanky, which are fortify as well as overpower, but not only that, they also integrate these mechanics right into the respective classes' skill trees to allow them to build characters of the specific fantasy and role without just having to rely on item customization. So first of all, what exactly is overpower? Well, it's essentially a chance for your character to deal bonus damage, kind of like with a critical strike, but it's a separate mechanic that actually depends on the amount of health plus fortify, which is sort of like a damage shield that you have. So the more of that shield that you generate, in addition to your max health, of course, the more damage your overpowers will do. And to further clarify what fortify means, as well as fortified, which is referring to a slightly different thing. First of all, fortify is the damage shield itself that also adds to overpower damage, which is not to be confused with barrier, which does not contribute to overpower, but still adds a shield. And next, fortified, which is a buff actually, is when you have enough shield from fortify that exceeds your maximum health. And when you do, you receive this fortified buff that reduces damage taken by 10%. And so with the clever implementation of these mechanics, Blizzard has actually made it so that not only can you build tanky on a character, but you actually get rewarded through damage by doing so. By stacking fortify or fortify chance, you'll be able to actually do more damage on your overpowers. And like I started to mention earlier, both of these mechanics have been very much implemented into the class fantasies and skill trees of three classes: the Barbarian, the Druid, as well as the Necromancer. They all have skills or passives on their skill tree that benefit from having fortify or overpower, or grant some of these bonuses themselves, with some abilities having guaranteed chances to overpower, which actually makes it even easier to trigger without having to rely on gear to boost your overpower chance, right? I think it's especially interesting that the Necromancer is actually a candidate for this type of tanky class fantasy. Actually, I'm all for it, and this is specifically with their blood spells, which have a lot of healing and fortification and overpower triggers. And it's also worth noting that they are, to my knowledge, the only class right now that can wield shields, which are looking like a very significant source of damage reduction. And speaking of gear, there are indeed also item affixes that can help augment this type of playstyle even further. And now, not only is customization more fun, viable, and interesting for tanks now, but in Diablo 4 they seem to be also more useful for party now, not only just because by building tank gear again you actually get to do more damage, but also because it just seems to be more monster, boss, and dungeon mechanics that can be better countered by having a tank or several tanks in your group. For example, many bosses seem to have quite vicious melee attacks. Some of them are even sort of sweeping cleave type attacks, which means having a tankier party member to hold aggro, so to speak, using a bit of MMO speak here, which is basically keeping the boss's attention and having it attack the tank primarily, which seems to happen quite frequently in Diablo 4, and also having the tank being able to sort of self-sustain through not only self-healing in some cases, but also more notably fortify mechanics to be able to keep replenishing shields. I imagine that this can be quite helpful and good to have in a party, especially with higher end difficulty content. And what's more is that a lot of bosses also seem to have certain projectile mechanics, which can also probably benefit from there being some primary damage soaking members in your party, in addition to them just trying to soak up some of the boss's basic attacks. But of course, the intention should not be to try to pigeonhole players into specific party compositions or specialization choices. But I think, for example, with 3 different classes having decent access to fortify and overpower mechanics, and by the way, they don't have to spec completely into those, they can sort of mix and match by, for example, speccing partially into fortify. I think and hope there will still be a decent middle ground where players shouldn't have to feel obliged to spec tanky, but also they can still try to do so, and it would perhaps be good to have, but in a party it by no means will be something that is completely necessary, right? Unlike what a traditional MMO would dictate, which of course Diablo is definitely not an MMO. And this is why I also think Diablo 4 can and probably already is trying to sort of reinvent party roles and allow for even different types of, say, spec archetypes. So beyond the aforementioned tank and damage soaker type of role, there can even be a sort of support role or a very specific type of support or expansion upon that, which I think Diablo is starting to do with things like the vulnerable mechanic, which is a type of debuff or character state that causes more damage to be taken and can be applied by certain skills. And at first glance, although this doesn't seem all that interesting, it can actually open up quite a lot of party mechanics and specs, because the way it works is that it's a debuff and can only be applied once. So then different characters that apply vulnerable don't apply like 2 stacks of vulnerable. No matter who applies it, the character or the enemy will just become vulnerable. And so what can happen is in a party you would have, for example, a couple of designated vulnerable appliers. Of course, you don't have to have every character or every party member apply it, right? Because that would be redundant. So you can actually assign specific players in your party to take on that role. And this can especially be even more interesting because of mechanics and item affixes, namely ones that increase the amount of damage dealt to vulnerable targets. So for instance, a somewhat optimized party could have 1 or 2 designated vulnerable appliers, while everybody in the party also focuses on the increased damage to vulnerable targets affix on their items. And for another type of party role that Diablo 4 seeks to expand on, and that is the designated, again, CC applier, which not only works for your general monsters, but also in Diablo 4 on bosses as well. Not for crowd control, but actually to fill their stagger bar, which is actually a new, again, type of boss mechanic that can be extremely significant, because by staggering a boss by filling up the meter through crowd control spells, you can actually make a fight significantly easier. And although I wasn't able to personally experience this during the beta, and perhaps some more numbers tuning is warranted, but according to what I've heard, for example, if you stagger the Ashala world boss, she'll actually be CC'd for I think 10 or more seconds with one of her wings being torn, and the fight will also become easier in that not only will she be stunned, allowing players to essentially free fire on her for a few seconds, but the fight will also apparently, from what I've heard at least, become easier after the stagger as well, with one of her wings being damaged. And so assuming that staggering a boss is an actually viable strategy, this could definitely again open up additional party options and specs. For example, with party members prioritizing picking more CC spells to be able to stagger a boss, and also crowd control enemies along the way, or things like ads during a boss fight. And also, this would probably incentivize players to itemize for things like debuff duration, which I'm not sure if that will apply to applying more stagger, but things like cooldown reduction through plus skills, right? So there are plus skill attributes that you can get from gear that can definitely reduce the cooldown on your spells, including your CC spells, which can allow you to contribute to a stagger bar more frequently. So with that, I do think that Diablo 4 is starting to set up for a decent basis, at least, for group play. And if they come up with, say, additional group type activities and even incentives such as group leaderboards, this could definitely incentivize more depth to the game by having just additional ways to play and think about the game, and perhaps to make the game a bit more social and friendly or group friendly or clan friendly, while also still keeping the integrity of solo play by allowing players who prefer that to progress through and enjoy the game just as much. So anyhow, what do you think about Diablo 4's potential to add more multiplayer type content? Let me know in the comment section below, and I'll definitely read and reply to your comments. Again, all opinions are welcome here, and also if you liked the video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel for more. And with that, I will catch you in the next video. Peace.